Вітання всім! Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Мене звати Ангеліна Карякіна, а разом зі мною
Наталка Гуменюк. Вітання!
Привіт, Наталко! Наталко, ти сьогодні представляєш нам свою розмову зі словацьким публіцистом Мартином Шимечкою, автором книги, яка є перекладена українською мовою серед словаків. Коротка історія байдужості від Дубчика до Фіца, бо як я став патріотом. Така особиста історія Словаччини, бо історія Словаччини через особисту призму. Розкажи, будь ласка, чому ти вирішила поговорити з Мартіном і де ви з ним познайомилися, зустрілися? Що це за історія?
Мартін – відомий словацький, можна сказати, дисидент. І він син відомого чеського дисидента Мілана Šimečky, який був радником Václava Haveli, інтелектуал і журналіст. Так, він за свій час був головним редактором більшості словацьких видань. З Мартином Šimečкою я особисто, скажімо так, це навіть не вперше познайомилася, а нормально так познайомилася навесні цього року, коли я була на заході, присвяченому 50-літтю Гельсінських угод в Гельсінкі відбувався, і там збиралися різні європейські інтелектуали. І це була людина, яка надзвичайно активно брала участь у дискусіях, постійно підтримувала Україну, ставила іншим спікерам гострі питання, говорила про потребу більшої підтримки. Я зізнаюся в цьому в своєму інтерв'ю. Словаччина не є країною, яка, скажімо так, була в сфері моїх інтересів, чи я мала багато знайомств серед словацьких і навіть чеських, чесно кажучи, інтелектуалів. Але оскільки я їхала до Словаччини на захід, на саміт впливу, називається Impact Summit, куди мене запросили, то я, звісно, зрозуміла, що Мартін, очевидно, саме та людина, з якою хотілося б поспілкуватися. І додам ще таку деталь, що, знаєте, це той випадок, коли хотілося підтримати словацький саміт своєю присутністю, тому що громадські організації Словаччини зараз перебувають під тиском влади, і для мене це також в чомусь був візит солідарності. Я хотіла приїхати, ми не встигли перетнутися з Мартіном, зокрема, упродовж того одного дня, коли я була у Братиславі, тому ми записали цю розмову, і я додам, що я дійсно закликаю всіх придбати книжку. Я одразу дорогою написала видавництво «Дух і літера», сказала, можна купити книжку, вона є, я буду записувати розмову. Мені її подарували, і не одну. Дуже-дуже вдячна і дуже популяризую. Чесно кажучи, це називається «It made my day», «It made my trip». Тобто це була книжка-подарунок, вона про суспільство, яке є байдужим, і як є люди, які борються проти байдужості свого суспільства. Вона глибоко мене зачепила, тому я була просто щаслива з Мартіном поговорити, на щастя, прочитавши вже кілька його книжок.
Розумію, що в книжці багато йдеться там про історичні події, які, напевно, ведуть до сьогодення. Розкажи, на чому ви фокусувалися з точки зору от сьогоднішньої ситуації? Да, ми розуміємо, словацький уряд, який, м'яко кажучи, скептично налаштований по відношенню до України, якщо так можна сказати. Та й загалом ситуація, в якій Фіцо, який пішов у відставку після вбивства відомого словацького журналіста Яна Куцика, повернувся знову на політичну арену. Довкола чого крутилася ваша розмова? Наскільки Мартін взагалі слідкує за тим, що відбувається в Україні? Наскільки він обізнаний з нашою ситуацією?
Моя розмова насамперед про відносини частково України і Словаччини, і як ми можемо їх пояснювати, як ми можемо пояснити певні проросійські настрої в словацькому суспільстві, появу такого персонажа, як Фіцо, з яким Мартін, очевидно, як один з ключових редакторів країни, знайомий. Він свою книжку будує на певній відмінності досвіду спротиву чехів від словаків, але постійно говорить про сьогодення. І, власне, ми й говорили, як так сталося, що країна, яка на початку повномасштабного вторгнення надзвичайно підтримувала Україну. Я нагадаю, що Словаччина фактично продала нам все, що тільки можна з своїх арсеналів, бо в них була б зброя, радянська зброя, і, до речі, ця країна була одним з дуже великих виробників зброї, а ще в соціалістичному блоці. Тому в них от дуже багато чого ми отримували в 22-му році, було словацьким, і вони встигли віддати нам буквально все. Так само вона рятувала нас, коли були питання з реверсом газу. Тобто ця країна дійсно нам помогла. А зараз ця країна, скажімо так, намагається навіть нашкодити так Україні, хоча ми сусіди. І от мене цікавила ця відмінність цих суспільств, на якому етапі, як це сприймати. Мартін ще дуже багато пише про речі, які, чесно кажучи, відгукувалися, наприклад, його вибір бути словаком, маючи відомого чеського батька, залишатися в Братиславі в кризові роки, коли в 90-ті були і такі зародки диктатури в Словаччині. Він постійно йшов до вибору, що для того, щоб писати про своє суспільство, я маю лишатися в Братиславі. Я не хочу бути людиною, яка там переїжджає до Праги, хоча його кличуть, чи бути стипендіатом всіх європейських стипендій, куди його кличуть. Тобто ми говорили про оцю байдужість, яка виникла до інших в словацькому суспільстві, яку він називає причиною появи таких елементів, як Фіцо, появи проросійських рухів. Він жартує, що зараз, бо він написав нову книжку, але редактор йому не дозволив її назвати серед фашистів, як і жити серед суспільства, частини з якої він не погоджується. А щодо його того, як він слідкує за Україною, важливо віддати належне Мартіну, що він є тим голосом, який дуже категорично, знаєш, такою в чомусь дисидентською категоричністю просто вимагає від свого суспільства підтримки України. Він не просто приїжджав в Україну як автор, як журналіст, але й так само з гуманітарними місіями, там відвозити щось на фронт, відвозити якісь машини. Тобто він продовжує ще й таку свою діяльність, тому що наполягає, що підтримка України є надзвичайно критичною. Тому я його запитувала і про Словаччину, але також і, скажімо, певне таке уособлення, його розуміння сучасної Європи. З тим певним розчаруванням, так, континенту, який, можливо, до кінця не розуміє, чому потрібно чинити спротив. Ми говорили про покоління, які, можливо, не чинять спротив, бо втратили ці м'язи, бояться ризикувати. Все-таки це дійсно розмова з сином дисидента, з людиною, яка зростала в колі дисидентів, людей, які ризикували, який, скажімо, через свого батька, так, він не зміг вступити до якоїсь гімназії важливої і не міг провадити якусь більш інтелектуальну діяльність, а мав там навчатися в училищі, яке вивчає нафтогазову справу, умовно кажучи. Так? Він проходив весь шлях, скажімо, утисків, і попри те, що це Словаччина, так, це не якась там диктаторська країна, це наша країна західний сусід, він все-таки завжди був в позиції трошки борця. Так? І його син є одним з очільників політичної партії, тобто він людина з особливої родини, але я тобі скажу, настільки надзвичайно скромна, що це теж надзвичайно якось так тішить, бо я зустрічаю багатьох людей, але, скажімо так, людей, які поводяться так скромно і непомітно, і комунікують, і спілкуються з такою якоюсь абсолютною простотою, знаєш, я там звичайний житель, умовно, Братислави, і не буду казати, що там, умовно кажучи, людина, з якою я найбільше часу провів в дитинстві, це Václav Havel. Він не буде це говорити, якщо ти не запитаєш. Я ще додам, що я рада, що в нашому подкасті, коли все має значення, ми так само маємо змогу розповідати про наших найближчих сусідів. Так, ми говоримо про далекі світи, Бразилії, Південні Африки і що завгодно, але ось останні в цьому сезоні у нас є і Польща, і Молдова, і Словаччина, тому так нам не байдужі і наші сусіди.
Та, я себе зловила на думці, що я хочу тебе ще далі тобі задавати запитання, що буде звучати як моє інтерв'ю з тобою про твоє інтерв'ю з Шимечкою. Давайте слухати розмову Наталки з Мартіном Шимечкою, відомим словацьким дисидентом, публіцистом, автором книги «Коротка історія байдужості від Дубчика до Фіцо» серед словаків вона називається і видана українською мовою у видавництві «Дух і літера». Давайте слухати.
Ми дуже дякуємо нашим слухачам, вам за ту підтримку, яку ви здійснюєте для цього подкасту, зокрема для роботи наших чудових колег, звукорежисерки Люби Гук і редакторки Іри Лопатіної. І на прохання ваше ми це зробили. Ми створили на сторінці лабораторії журналістики суспільного інтересу не просто сторіночку, де ви можете донатити за реквізитами, але й можливість робити одноразовий донат і регулярний донат. Довелося нам попрацювати над цим, але тепер це можливо. Знаю, що ці донати приходять. Це дуже-дуже нас підтримує. Знаємо, що в Україні багатьох потрібно підтримувати, але якщо є така змога, щоб ці розмови далі виходили, ми вам неймовірно вдячні. Це дуже надихає.
Martin, I'm really happy to talk to you. Also because I've just recently been to Slovakia and I'm quite rare there. I really don't know the country, to be honest, but also I was reading your book on Among the Slovaks, which you'll see it's like as full of the marks. I really loved it. And I mean, I have like full notebook of the quotes. But you write something striking, and probably this is with what I would start. It's really about the indifference, like indifference of the society, and that indifference is the biggest alliance of evil because it prevents it from being spread. And just coming right away from Aleppo, the last conversation I had was with a Syrian activist who is from the West Aleppo, which is more rich, then moved during the war, during the uprising to the east, which was almost destroyed. Actually, now, of course, they are returning. And those activists really saying that when we chatted just before my departure, they were really saying that what was striking for them, it was the indifference of the people of the West to the people on the East. And East is kind of completely erased, and the West stayed. And for them, what they really actually want, the only thing they really want, some kind of an acknowledgement. But they also spoke about indifference. And, it was striking. So that's why I was so much keen to talk to you right away. That's why I ask, why you think indifference, I think it's also something which is a peril of modern Europe and the modern world, is so dangerous.
It's troubling me because I see it all the time. And all my life as Czech Chulis, I'm witness of indifference of many people. First of all, of course, in the communist regime, there was an indifference of people to their own fate. As a nation, as a society, that was for me, from the beginning, horrifying. But then I understood that's probably the natural attitude of most of people who are not able to, who don't have enough empathy towards those who they don't know. It's not only the indifference, like in Slovakia, indifference of many people towards Ukraine is horrifying for me. Not only indifference, but sometimes even wishing that Russians will win. That's one of a third of societies like that, or 20%, let's say, are directly wishing Russians to win. But the indifference of the West towards Eastern Europe, I remember that very well. There are some texts and essays which can change that. And what did this change, the indifference of the West to the Eastern or Central Europe, was Milan Kundera's essay about Central Europe. I don't know whether you know it. It was published in 81, 82. Brilliant essay, by the way, although I'm not a big fan of Milan Kundera. But this was a fantastic text, a moral appeal on the West, not to forget Central Europe, because it's part of that continent, culturally, morally, and etc., historically. And I remember that among many European intellectuals, this text has changed their attitude. And even then, it spread to politicians. So I think there are chances to change it. And I think one thing is the indifference in the nation itself, in society. I mean, like we are now in Slovakia, although there are a lot of passions now, but basically it's indifference to its own fate as a nation. But then there is this indifference of the nations towards the other nations who suffer. And I think that we have to live with that. I still believe that enough pressure, enough good texts targeting this indifference in the other societies, like in Western Europe, can change it. And I think, look, I mean, I can tell you one thing. I mean, my biggest fear was 15 years ago, more, when West didn't understand the Russian imperial policy. And the West was completely complacent about that. I remember that after annexation of Crimea, it was for me paradoxically a relief, because I finally recognized that West Europe understood this is something very wrong going on. At least I had a feeling, okay, West now understands and is not anymore indifferent to the Ukrainian fate and towards Russia as an enemy. So these positions and this indifference can be changed, but you see it, I mean, in the world there is so much suffering. People are mostly not able to just collaborate, to understand, to feel the empathy. It's not enough space in their hearts to do that. I mean, that's a logic of the world. I'm sorry, but that's a reality.
Your father is a Slovak, is a Czech dissident. Your mother is Slovak, but you are Slovak. You stayed in Bratislava. It's your society. And I think for us, a country which is bordering Slovakia, and I don't live in the Western Ukraine. So, like I actually don't have this kind of closer relations. Like people maybe in Uzhhorod, somehow I think we have too little interaction compared to the fact that we are neighbors. You really try to explain kind of the difference between the Czech society and the Slovak society. And I would probably ask you to maybe in some way summarize it and explain to us it also why Slovakia has Fico, today. Why the country, which is actually what also I want to also say, the previous government helped us very much. It given almost everything it could till the moment that like the military and some kind of ammunition was already gone, the old kind of like post-Soviet or Soviet type of the. So Slovakia was really helpful in the reverse, helping us with the energy reverse, which was also very, very critical during the first stage of the full-scale invasion. But now we really have the guy who is supporting Russia, who went to the 9th of the May parade out of very, very few global leaders. And I do think that still Ukrainians don't get it. We kind of lived for quite too long with Orban. I cannot see that we were fully surprised, but it's quite an unpleasant surprise, I should say.
First of all, Mr. Fico is in power with some, of course, periods where he was in opposition, but in power he's about 15 years. And he was a very talented populist. But then he has changed, populist, but still was a guy who was very pragmatic and was very actually pro-European. But then slowly he has changed into not the populist, but the autocrat with very pro-Russian attitude and actually anti-European. But the reasons are various. First of all, the last elections were 2 years ago. And he understood that if he wanted to win the elections, he had to change his electorate. Because before it was, the electorate was somehow in the middle somewhere. People mostly voted for him because of he was populist, but they still believed that he doesn't threat democracy, European integration and whatever. But this electorate has gone towards today's opposition, the more democratic politicians. And then the pandemic was crucial because I was in Slovakia. There was a huge kind of resistance to vaccination, supporting by then-time opposition, especially Mr. Fico, who used this as to become his electorate more passionate about, especially about the vaccination. But that was, of course, the part of society which was originally pro-Russian. Historically, we have in Slovakia maybe 1/3 of population more pro-Russian than the rest of society for historical reasons. And Fico, he used that electorate to develop in these people hatred, together with hatred against vaccination, the hatred against European Union, and supporting Russia. It was actually a kind of a pragmatical choice, but the result is that Mr. Fico is now actually hostage of these voters. When he is anti-European and anti-Ukrainian pro-Russian, it's because he himself educated his voters to be pro-Russian much more than they might have been before that, 5 or 10 years ago. So he's a hostage of them now. He has to meet Putin. He has to be pro-Russian because his voter wanted him to do that. So you have to understand, which of course I don't excuse him because that's the tragedy for this country. But this is one of the most important reasons why he's doing it, because otherwise, in your opinion, he's not completely like Orban. You know that Slovakia produces a lot of arms and shells for Ukraine to sell it, of course. He didn't block, actually, the sanctions. He all the time used it for blackmail, your opinion, but he's unlike Orban. He's a pragmatician, which, again, he's fanatic in his vocabulary, but he still knows that he needs your opinion more than Viktor Orban needs. He has no ideology. Unlike Orban, he's now in the trap. His government is very weak. He's trying to do everything to build autocratic regime, but he's not very successful in that. And he's full of hatred after the assassination last year. But still, to understand him, he's using his electorate and, on one hand, to win the elections, and he became a hostage of the same electorate. He might easily change his mind, but he cannot.
Why you say there is this tradition for having pro-Russians? Because it's not obvious for each country. So, for instance, you have populist, conservative, ultra-conservatives and far-right in Poland, for instance. But they're still anti-Russian. Like there is now a new movement, but it differs. So what makes that group of people in Slovakia?
Yeah, there are 2 or 3 reasons for that. One is, historically, we have the Slovak national intellectuals from 19th century, the most famous, who were actually pro-Russian, like this Slavianic idea. Actually, it was originated in Slovakia by Slovak intellectuals who believed in Russia because they hated Hungarians. So they thought that Russians would help them. And of course, they didn't recognize Ukrainian existence at all. So there was one reason that historically it's there, the sentiment for that. The second reason, which is much more important, is that unlike in Czech Republic, in communist times in Slovakia, especially after occupation by Russians, Slovaks have the memory of that last 2 decades of the communist regime, that their life standard went up very heavily, very much. There was a lot of industrial development in Slovakia, a lot of development because Slovakia was a poor country. So the many Slovaks, especially older generation, but also, their kids, their children, have this historical memory that under the Russian occupation, the life got better economically. Unlike in Czech Republic, Czech society was much more developed than Slovak, and they felt much more insulted by occupation, and their life standard didn't go up. So that's a historical memory of Slovaks, which is different from Czech society. Actually, when Russians were here, we were fine. Of course, it's not about freedom. It was about the memory of the life standard, which went really high up. And then the third reason is, I would say, the huge, huge Russian impact on Slovak society by all these disinformation. We have much more these kind of so-called alternative webs and social media, which are hugely attacked by Russian disinformation campaign, and Slovaks are, if you compare it to the Czech Republic, I mean, Russian embassy in Slovakia is very, very much more active than in Czech Republic and involved in these disinformation campaigns. So if you get it together, so you understand why. And yeah, it's true. I mean, you cannot compare it because Czechs, I mean, are maybe 5 to 10% of Czechs are somehow, would be willing to support, I mean, on Russia's side. But in Slovakia, you can measure it. The numbers differ, but it's 30%. But saying that, you still have to know that the majority of Slovaks are pro-Western, pro-European Union, and actually knowing that Russia is an enemy. So Fico is now ruling the country against its own will, if we take it as a society.
In your writing, you in fact kind of try to compare, and you afford yourself being a bit critical to your own Slovak society. You more or less speaking about this lack of the tradition of the open resistance which exists and traditionally is in Slovakia with people, which traditionally was in Czechia, where people were kind of defending their rights. You started to mention that it started to appear within the last years, those kind of like examples. Maybe you would just a bit explain. And I also would ask you, for us also it's curious because, I'm still from a generation when I remember there was Czechoslovakia. And like there are those two countries. How you describe the relations? Are they like it's an incredible examples of the countries which from outside, which are kind of like friends, like the family, but which stay friends. Because we used to have all the countries which were together, but then they have is a competition or there is a bigger one and smaller one, like these relations like we have with Russia. How would you describe both this difference in the societies, political, but also those two countries and societies, who they are to each other?
Basically, there was a kind of research about the relationship between various nations in Europe. And Slovaks and Czechs in European Union are the closest ally, far, far closer than any other nation in Europe, two nations in Europe. You can talk about Sweden, Swedes and Finns and whatever, but it's unlike anything. Czechs and Slovaks are very close. Even now, there are a lot of families together, everybody has relatives there. And there is a traditional, historical, kind of romantic relationship between Czechs and Slovaks from 19th century. And this still exists. The problem is, of course, that Slovaks, they had the feeling that the Czechs are superior to Slovaks. They are bigger, they are more developed. Their economy and industry is much more developed than Slovaks and so on. There was some resentment about, especially in communism or in First Czechoslovak Republic, that Czechs were kind of a little bit colonialist to Slovaks. But they did it with an idea to help Slovaks to become developed, to become, let's say, more Czechs, like Czechs. But this is forgotten because the split of Czechoslovakia actually left Slovaks to be, they had to try to develop themselves without any help of Czechs or whoever. And there is now, of course, the governments are different. The government of Mr. Heger was actually in contradiction with the government of Mr. Babiš, who is now again will be a prime minister. So, and they were when Mr. Fico was in power now. So, the government, which is now finishing after the elections, they already froze their relationship because of the attitude to Ukraine and Russia. But now, again, when Mr. Babiš will be again prime minister, so probably the relationship between the governments themselves will be again more friendly, I would say. But under that, there is a huge, still very strong link between the nations, which I think are unbreakable. But who knows? I think many Czechs were pretty surprised by the Slovak position towards Ukraine, especially towards Russia by this government. Looking at the polls where 1/3 of Slovaks actually supporting Russia, and the Czechs were completely shocked. So they discovered that Slovak nation is different than they were thinking. And that's true. The nations are very different historically, by nature, by culture, by religion. Slovaks are Catholics, Czechs are more or less atheist. And I know, because I'm bilingual in this, my parents were Czechs, so many Czechs think that I'm still Czech. Because my Czech language is just perfect as a mother language, mother tongue, as a Slovak one is. I criticize the Czechs also a lot because they are very self-centered. They think that they are the best in the world. My friend used to say that every Czech thinks that everybody in the world would like to be a Czech. They are so self-centered. That's why they are so suspicious against migrants, because they think that they want to be Czechs. In Slovakia, nobody would think about that anybody from the world would like to be a Slovak. We are very realistic. That's stupid that somebody would like to be a Slovak. So there are differences in attitude to its own society, and it will be a long talk. But the thing is that I still think that the relationship between these nations is very unique. These two nations never fought each other. Even the split was very peaceful, although I think it was not fair, whatever. But there was not even a kind of sign of a violence, unlike the other nations. And Slovaks were never occupied by Czechs, and vice versa. So you cannot compare it with the relationship between Russia and the Ukrainians until the war, because it was a huge friendship.
The next question I have, I want you to answer both in the context kind of more global, but also Slovakian. It's about some kind of not the return of history, but about going back, like undoing the good things. So I was in Bratislava in the Impact Summit, and on the stage, there were a few images of the people, kind of famous Slovaks, like these huge images when you do the design of the stage. And there was Vera Časlavska, the athlete who looked down when the Soviet anthem was playing during after the Soviet invasion to Prague. And for that, she was, what I understand, kind of politically repressed later. And Anton Schrolets, the dissident who was, I understand, later helping the poor, helping the homeless, a very important figure. Yeah, Anton Schrolets. And when I was looking at those, and actually because I needed to speak in Ukraine, and I needed to speak about Russia, not about Russia and Ukraine, I really was thinking that, indeed, we are in the time where I was shocked recently by the news in Russia, like the NGO worker who supported homeless was beaten by the Russian police just for showing humanity, for, not something political. Also you see that it's almost impossible for the Russians to show this dissent. We won't have to have it more. So you see that the societies can return to quite a horrible part. And we were speaking about that in the context of limiting political freedoms in Slovakia, in particular with the courts, with the current political government. But we are now also in the moment when we have the US doing what they do and understanding that, in fact, we really see how those kind of post-Cold War world is dismantled. So how do you see about the idea that the history is not a progress? What should we do to stop it? And is it really the case to present what we have, or maybe also think that something is wrong and to build something new, rather than just try to preserve what we have?
First of all, Vera Časlavska, who mentioned this gymnast, she was Czech, by the way. She was not Slovak. And Czechs were very proud of her. Talking about Slovak heroes, there are not many of them. And in Slovak history, most of these heroes who resisted, they were not successful. Most of them just ended badly, even sometimes extradicted by their own society. So their tradition of heroism is in Slovakia very low. What strikes me, what now for me, kind of a big hope is that, Slovak nation actually just lives as a nation, an independent nation, only 35 years, to have its own responsibility for its own fate. So we are actually facing the creation of a nation in these days. And it's a complicated thing, as you know. Reason for optimism in this government is horrible. It's just trying to kill the democratic institutions. But the resistance is actually bigger than I expected. In all spheres, from culture to even, injustice, you can see that the judges, I'm surprised by their courage, which is not very in Slovak tradition. And the police guys who are now punished by their honesty in the past, and etc. And many activists in the, the civic society, it's actually a phenomenon which I have to say I'm very pleasantly surprised. And then when I compare it, what is going on in America, actually when I compare it, what I'm shocked is how badly prepared were Americans to what is going on there. The resistance is much weaker when I see it in my country. All these big law firms, universities, of course, oligarchs, that's kind of understandable, and they want money. But why these big law firms, why the big universities are just trying to, obey Trump? It seems to me that the experience of the resistance is something we have to learn. And Slovaks have learned that in 19th, we have this populist Mečiar who tried to do the same like Fico is doing today. So we have already a historical memory from 25 years ago. That helps. So now more and more people, they remember, now their children remember how their parents were behaving with courage, resisting that time populist. But Americans haven't this tradition. They never, had to probably really defend democracy by sacrificing a lot of things. Sometimes a lot of money, sometimes your jobs, whatever. It seems to me that America has to learn a lesson which Eastern Europe has learned a lot in communist times and in history. And Americans were very proud that they are free, and then nothing can threaten their freedom. Now they are entrapped by their own inexperience.
Or maybe it's even, about the generation, because of course all the protest for the civil rights movement, it was still like 50s, 60s. And this is not exactly what this generation is. And I would, because of what you're saying, I would return to this Syrian activist who lives actually in New York, Marcel Chevaro. I'm just so deeply impressed by a conversation with her. And as she exactly said, that that the Western journalists may write that, oh, Syrians are speaking in the cafes about politics. And she says look, we did politics for many years, but my question to the America, and where she now resides in New York, said how many people do you know who would risk to go in prison for their views? And if I count my friends in Syria, I can easily count 100 people. And I won't find one in the US, despite their prisons are very different from Assad prisons, and they would have the lawyers. And I started to think about that. And do you think it's also something the generation lost, not just in the US, but in some of the European countries? And what do you think can kind of move it forward? In the US, there is Trump. In Europe, I do think that there is something like the shadow of the possible Russian invasion. But I do think that there is something also in the societies when, for this generation, they just don't know how to fight.
Yeah, I agree. That's the thing. You can learn by reading history, of course, by reading books. You can learn that. But how many people read books on history? Then you have to learn on your own life. Look, when you see what's going on in Germany, in France, there is a lot of resistance against Le Pen or AfD. Of course, you don't risk to go to prison protesting against AfD. That's true. But that's a first step that people may learn, at least, that some activity you need to do to preserve your freedom But it's all my life experience. It's very difficult to explain to somebody coming from the West or from democratic countries with that tradition how important is to be prepared to sacrifice your freedom, to go into prison. I mean, just to be prepared, mentally prepared. That's what these people in the West probably are not able to just work with, because that's not the idea they lived with.
What do you tell? You're saying like you're trying for a long time to explain. What arguments do you use?
I mean, that's the problem, is that my arguments never really are working, because I try to explain them our experience. People in West Europe, of course, it's a problem that the value of life and freedom is so high that it's tricky just to imagine that you can sacrifice that, or you can just be poorer, whatever. And I tell them, look, if you don't accept that the freedom has its price, then you will never really understand it, and then you will have to learn it on your own skin. But I can tell you, I have a lot of friends in Europe. Some of them know it, but there are exceptions. The society as such, as we have said at the beginning, I mean, the indifference towards the suffering of the others is in the sense that these people may admire you and Ukrainians. They do, definitely. They can't imagine that they would do the same, because they can't think in these terms and in these patterns. I'm afraid that unless they will have to learn that lesson on their own skin, I only hope that the lesson will be not too hard. You still can fight for your freedom, making some, you have to be a victim of some oppression, but I hope it will be not too hard. Then you learn it. Actually, in Slovakia, it was the same. I mean, the people in this fight now, and even 25 years ago, it was not about being imprisoned more. It was about losing your job, being, of course, sometimes threatened, sometimes, the police came after you, but it was never so much about losing the freedom, going into prison. And it still helps. These people have learned the lessons, even in actually softer circumstances.
You wrote that, you can kind of guess from the faces who are the doctors who take bribes, but it's very hard to guess from the faces who are the patients who give the bribes. And I'm speaking more than about the societies as well, because yes, I'm quite a person who urge that the people should be citizens, like that they should be active. And by the way, where is my biggest hope in Ukraine, disregarding all the troubles, political troubles, the war, but generally, all the ruptures the Russian violence bring to us. I see that, what makes Ukraine so strong beyond everything in Ukrainian society, that because you're forced by the extreme environment to participate in the public life. Your son is serving in the army. Your husband is serving in the army. You are serving in the army. You give something to the state. You volunteer. You donate. You maybe help your village. You maybe help your street. You help somebody. And that's why, because you actively participate as a citizen, not just as an individual, like as a member of the family, you kind of have the demand from the society. You have these relations, like that of cooperation, wherever you called it. And that's, for me, is a sign when I hear that the people whom I even didn't expect are not any longer indifferent, because they've already did something and they want something in return, like that makes them not indifferent. But I can't expect societies and a lot of people just like not be, like who maybe vote, but not active. So where do you see is this, the balance for you as well, that not everybody would be the hero, and there are some minimum which you can expect from some people, and you can't demand also like being this kind of intellectual who said like the people should, the people must. You also kind of couldn't be arrogant to the people who just try to lead their lives.
First of all, I want to say that I was following very closely the affair in Ukraine and this corruption scandal. And my impression is that I really do believe that Ukrainians are on a road to well, at least fight the corruption effectively in time. Of course, it will be not soon, but still. Basically, people hate corruption, but most of them adapt if that's a situation. But we talk about two types of corruption. One is this, and then you go to the doctor and whatever. You want to save your life, and then choice is obvious for most of the people. But I have the kind of a maybe naive anthropologic explanation of that. Slovaks hate the corruption. I mean, we actually have very good laws against corruption in Slovakia, only that the elite doesn't just obey them. That's a problem. It's a basic, really basic resistance or at least hatred against corruption by majority. But that's why it is that. It's not only, as you say, that we citizens expect from the state the service because we give it, not like in Ukraine, but if we give our taxes to them, to the state. But why the corruption still in Slovakia? I think it's a corrupted country. But it used to be less corrupted in the previous times. Now, because of this government, it's hugely corrupted. But people are really pissed off, very much. And this probably will, why Fico will lose the next elections next time, except the economic is going down and so on. But what strikes me all the time was that in Hungary, the corruption is much, much bigger. On a state level, it's huge. And people don't protest so much. You can't compare the corruption in Hungary and Slovakia in a sense, because it's on a state level really very high. And I think it's the history, because Hungarians were used to that they had the kingdom for hundreds and hundreds of years, where the king just gave his gifts to the land to all who served him. So that's a national kind of habit. Okay, those who serve to the king, they will get the gifts, they will get the land, they will get the castles and whatever. So Hungarians in their somehow thinking about themselves, they still feel not so much like citizens, but by like more those who are owned by the king. That's a tradition. But Slovaks were never actually had a kingdom. They were all the time only this peasant, the plebiscite society, where never, no Slovak actually was really rich in all our history. So people are pissed off because who is rich doesn't deserve it. In the Slovaks' eyes, he must have stolen this money. And mostly they are right. And I don't know, how is it in Ukraine?
We're quite equal society, by the way, if you look at the world, because wars and those tragedies where there were great erasers and our elite was wiped out so many times by the Tsarist, by the revolution, by the Holodomor, by the Second World War. And, I think the inequality started to grow maybe last decade after 90s. There were 90s, but things started to grow. And then this war is again his great eraser. So some of our rich has also lost much. And I'm also joking quite a lot with traveling around the world saying, we're quite lucky, which is a bit of the black humor, that we had never been great. So that's why we have just a future ahead of us. We have nothing to go to our past.
I agree with you. And I mean, my position, when we are the very small, 5 million. Slovaks are just, and actually they were never really interested in Ukraine in the past until the war came. In 90s, nobody knew about Ukraine actually in this country. Everybody was looking west. I think Slovaks still didn't understand. I was in Ukraine last 2 years, twice to drive the ambulances to the front line and whatever. So, and I have been a couple of times before in Ukraine. All the time I felt this enormous strength of the Ukrainian people, enormous, comparing to Slovaks. I mean, the energy. And so I am absolutely convinced that in a moment when Ukraine will get some peace, which allows them to really start, Slovaks will be just a shadow in the Ukrainian hegemony. We know it. Poles are like that. We looked down on Poles who were just, some small business people, poor. In 90s, they were poorer than we had been. And in communism, they had nothing to eat almost. Now they are It's a huge nation and very rich. So in this sense, I think Slovaks are basically stupid. They don't understand that they need Ukraine to be the best friends, because otherwise, you will just go above us. You will just don't care about Slovakia. And you're very right. And Fico is doing very bad service for Slovaks, because I think Ukrainians will not forget these 2 years. I hope they might excuse us if the government will change. But still, there is clever people in Slovakia say, my God, we need Ukraine. We need Ukrainians because they are much, much bigger. We have to be friends with them. We have to make business with them. Well, that's a stupidity of the small nation which doesn't understand, especially these government doesn't understand that. I mean, that's obvious. But I agree with you that, like Slovakia, Ukraine is actually building its nation finally, in a sense that you have a big chance. We also, Slovaks, have a big chance, but they have to understand that. Until now, they are reluctant to understand that.
You also wrote how the lady who was in the passport service, wherever you call it, was kind of like positively surprised that you accepted the Slovak citizenship because it was a political choice for you. But also what you were writing, that especially during turbulent times of the 90s, where there was some of kind of political pressure, you were very often invited to all those conferences, fellowships in the West, and you could easily go somewhere, but you made the decision that you need to be in Bratislava, that you cannot stay for instance, for some longer time in Prague when you were working for Respect, because first of all, you need to have a legitimacy while being in the place to speak about the place and being critical to the place and to share the burden, share the destiny of your people. You also were saying that in such a small countries living, because the kind of the community, the intellectual community, wherever you call it, active community is so small, going somewhere is weakening this community. And that's what I'm thinking a lot. Of course, we have a huge discussion in Ukraine about those who left Ukraine, and I would exclude the mothers with the kids. But there is a discussion, at this particular moment when life is dangerous, but it's livable. We all know, people who listen to this podcast, people who traveled, you understand that for quite a lot of people, it's a choice. But why, for you, it's so important, this decision not to be elsewhere in the fellowship, not to stay elsewhere, but to physically be present in Bratislava? Because you're exactly this type of a person who always had the opportunity, but also you were always kind of welcomed. You were always invited, as if you were always invited to pull out of Bratislava, but you prefer to stay.
Well, first of all, I think it has a lot to do with my family history. And also because I'm a writer, and as a writer, I had to be here because I want to write to this society. I mean, I want to talk to this society. I knew it when I was years. I lived in Prague, leading this weekly Respect. I felt like I'm losing this deep connection to the Slovakia, the Slovak society, and I, as a writer, I hated that. That's first thing. The second, well, it was in my family history. My father was in prison in the 80s, and when he went out, and the Secret Service and the regime actually offered us, because my father got some offer from American University to be a professor at the American University. And the communists told us, okay, go, all family, just go. You, of course, will never come back, but you can go. In our family, we voted. And we all voted for staying. Yeah, it was our family. I mean, my brother, my mother, and my father, and we were sitting in the kitchen and saying, "Okay, there is this chance. We have this offer. How would you vote for? What would you vote for?" And we all voted for staying. Although it was just in that 82 or 83, it was just you had no future in that times. But exactly because I felt I would leave my friends alone. I couldn't do that. I just couldn't do that. I don't judge people for that decisions when they leave the country, but my moral position is absolutely clear. I will not. Thinking about those who stay, my loyalty to those who live here is so deep I don't think that my life is so important to live better if these people stay here. I mean, I'm not that centristic to myself. It's also, I don't believe very much that anybody, not myself, but I know about myself, but I think anybody who lives outside, and especially if it is intellectual, you will never become a part of that society where you emigrated. You will never become. You will be all the time the emigrant. And I hate that. To be an immigrant, you don't understand. You can understand the language. You can speak perfectly English, whatever, but you will never be part of them. And I'm part of society here, although in this society, I live with the fascists. And I openly say, you are the fascists, especially the government. It's clear fascism. 1/3 of the society is fascistic today in Slovakia. And I still choose to live among them. Actually, I have written a book now just a month ago. I mean, it's difficult to translate. It's kind of extraordinary times or extraordinary state, which is something, whatever. And the undertitle is How to Live Well in Bad Times. It's all essays about how to, how to create, how to live in your own friendship among people who have the same values as you have, how important it is to build these kind of societies. And I also say that there is this fascistic 1/3 of society. Well, to hell with them. I know. I mean, I live among them, and I wanted to, the title should be like, when this book is among Slovaks, I wanted to write a book with the title Among Fascists. but the editor didn't allow me to do that. But it's still, the Slovak fascist is somehow closer to me than some Portuguese liberal intellectual. Although, of course, Portuguese liberal intellectual is a friend of mine. Of course, he's very close to me. But in a sense of national feeling, that fascist, at least I understand him. I mean, I know where it comes from. I mean, where are the roots of this fascism? So, and it's interesting. Of course, it's disgusting. Sometimes I'm very frustrated. And I'm so much ashamed of my country, especially because of this government, because of this, what they do towards Ukrainian and what they say. I'm deeply ashamed. And that's what I think is one of our tragedy of democratic people, that, in communist regime, I didn't feel ashamed of being living in communist regime, because that regime was not mine. The regime was different. It was just foreign regime. I wasn't a part of that. I was a dissident. I just told them, I mean, you are not mine. So I was not ashamed. But democracy, even if it betrays you, like in Slovakia today, you still feel the regime is yours because it's democratic. So you take it personally. I all take this personally. And that's why I'm so ashamed. Actually, it's much harder than I could imagine in the past to be so much ashamed toward especially Ukrainians. I can tell you it's not easy.
The guilt and the shame, it's also part of your empowerment and kind of being responsible, because you may believe that you influence something, and you do, which is a good sign rather than being just not part of something. I cannot not mention that you really grew up among those dissidents, a famous one, including Václav Havel, who you know well. And, I'm quite curious, what kind of special personality he was. And you also say that, the successful politician, he fills the time. And it felt like Havel felt the time, and we quite lacking the politicians who fill the time. So what made Havel special? Because wherever I go, people say like, oh, there is no Havel. He became such a big kind of like symbol of that. So what did he have that the people are lacking, today? And maybe we would get them.
Of course, there are people like Václav Havel, of course, because all his life, it's such a miracle. So now we feel, I mean, it's nothing like him in today politics or intellectual circles. I think it's not true, but I only can mention that Václav Havel really, he was charismatic in a sense that his brain, he was so smart. He was and he has such a sense of humor. And I remember that many times, whatever he said was so interesting. I mean, he has such a thinking, which was really special, although I really was raised by the best intellectuals in Czechoslovakia in the times, but he was special. But I have to say that this authority he had was also based on the sacrificing he made to be in prison for where he almost died. So you need to have very specific talent, but also the courage and the personality and especially this moral attitude that you are able and you are prepared to sacrifice even your life for the values you believe in. And that's also very special. You can have brilliant intellectuals who are morally not the strongest, or you can have the activists who are with a lot of courage, but they are not so much intellectual. And in Havel, it was together. That was very specific. He's still my kind of this spiritual father, and I still think of him many times.
And my final is, I'm now in Germany, and there is a forum organized mainly by Germans. And I see it's like the major thing they discuss about where Europe is heading, in the context of the how the United States are actually blackmailing Europe, pressuring Europe, and the first time in very recent history, there is even national defense policy, which is more or less more positive towards the usual adversaries of the US and the most critical to the Europe. For this year, I think we met in May, but this year is really very much overshadowed by Trump relations with Europe. I'm speaking as a Ukrainian, but do you think that the Europeans, with your friends, you know the continent very well, it's your place, is waking up? What is your diagnosis? Or it's still in a denial mode, or things are moving? I'm kind of more positive, but I'm curious, what do you think?
Okay, I mean, sometimes I'm deeply frustrated. Actually, every morning, until I get a coffee. But if I think about all this, I'm more optimistic than pessimistic. I think that the process of understanding, and the Russians are doing a good job, that Europe realizes the danger. So I think, yes, it is. It's all the time we debated about that decades that Europeans, the generation who was who lived through the Second World War, who created European Union, is gone. So now the new generation has forgotten the war. Now they are. I think that the deep instinct and the deep kind of lesson still is in the generation of politicians today, that the history is coming back and they will have to fight for freedom in Europe. So I think, and they know that Ukraine is for them actually the biggest help in this. So I'm rather optimistic. Of course, I may be wrong, and that would be an end, especially countries like Slovakia. If we are under Russian influence, they will shoot me. I'm absolutely clear about that. My son they will shoot him because he's a leader of oppositional party. We know that. And I still think that European Union and European politicians understand the threat, and they will try to do some, and maybe the history will show. But I think the change of European attitude towards actually even America today, it changes so fast. I remember European Union was so reluctant to do anything. Decade ago, it was crazy. I remember all these cases, the big financial crisis in Greece and whatever. I was all the time scared that European Union wouldn't be able to decide. And it appears all the time that they made the decisions. And by the way, the latest numbers shows that the people living in European Union are big fans of European Union. The majority of people like European Union. So the politicians they also somehow have the huge majority backed their decisions because they can feel the support of the public, or European public, to defend Europe.
Martin, it's such a pleasure to talk to you, kind of very reassuring, but also, I know, like a nice conversation. So I'm very glad for that we finally have it, just to kind of find ourselves on the same page somehow. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. And yeah, good luck. And please, if anybody in Ukraine listens to this, I never felt this kind of deep relationship with Ukrainians. Like, I couldn't imagine that some nation I will admire so much as I do now. I know all the troubles, but still, please, not all Slovaks are so stupid as Mr. Fico.